Hi everyone, welcome. I'm Sarah Mazri. I'm one of the educational developers at the center. Today I'm joining you from the GTA, just around Toronto. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. As you all know, we had our first National Day of Truth and Reconciliation on September 30th, a day for reflection, but hopefully we go beyond that day, and as educators, we sort of take that into account and think about that and reflect on it as all aspects of our teaching and learning. Welcome to this SoTL 101 workshop. This is the first of a few series for the launch of our Teaching Fellows program. As you may have seen, we have launched our Teaching Fellows program, which is a 2-year fellowship, and our first cohort will be starting in January, and our second cohort will be starting in September. Each cohort will have 3 fellows. We're looking for applications by November 15th, applications that think about substantial and sustainable changes to course level, program level, or curriculum level changes to enhance the student learning, keeping in mind the priority focus areas of the center as well as the university, which are advancing Indigenous initiatives and decolonization, anti-racist teaching, inclusive teaching, mental health and well-being, the student experience, experiential learning, and internationalization. On October 21st, we will have a panel of different folks across the university that do some SoTL work, just to show you a flavor of what SoTL looks like in different disciplines. And on November 1st, we'll have a writing and feedback retreat where you're welcome to come in, learn more about the fellowship and the different aspects of it, and have some chance to brainstorm and look through your projects, basically. So today we have a special guest and facilitator, Dr. Nicholas Simmons, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Studies at Brock University. Dr. Simmons has held national and international leadership roles in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and as a chair of the Educational Developers Caucus. She focuses on higher and adult education, including SoTL, lifelong learning, and leadership. She's been named a 3M National Teaching Fellow and Brock's inaugural Open Access Award winner in 2017. So we're in great hands today to really tell us all about SoTL, what SoTL is, and get all your questions answered. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and welcome to everybody. It's lovely to see the group. I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully you'll find the slides more engaging than just my face and my lovely garden zinnias behind me. But before I do that, I just wanted my disclaimer for the slides. They're a little bit text rich, and that was intentional because we know that there will be people who can't attend in person. So we're hoping that will allow the slides to stand on their own for those who can't come. So I'll just pull those up now. And my intention today is to walk you through a number of questions that you might have, and to stop from time to time and check in with you as to whether or not I'm addressing your questions, what else you'd like to talk about, so that we can tailor our time together so that you get the best possible use from it. You may or may not be thinking about going for a teaching fellowship this year. It might be something that is on your future horizon, but either way, the big push for today is to prepare you for that, prepare you to think about any kind of inquiry you might make about your teaching and learning, and or to help you build on what you may already be doing. Sarah, thank you for doing the land acknowledgement to start. And I really do like to think about how this connects to me personally and how it connects to me in terms of the teaching and learning work that I do, as well as the research that I do. I live on land that's been in my family for 3 generations, and we celebrate that frequently. We look at things like grapevines that my grandfather planted. But I didn't grow up in a family that gave consideration to the generations and the peoples who came before our family. And as I turn now to thinking about who was here first and the ways in which I'm the newcomer on the land, that my family is the newcomers. It makes me think about the parallel path in scholarship of teaching and learning nationally and internationally. Who has been here? Who are the newcomers? How do we welcome newcomers into the space? And how do we as newcomers be good guests and continue along with an open heart and invitation in every direction and respectful practices? So I just invite you to think about what it means to you to be guests on Indigenous land, and how you, decolonize, how you deconstruct some of the power structures that were put in place by our ancestors, so that we're not excluding others along the way. So here's a whole brainstorm list of questions based on dozens and dozens and dozens of workshops with faculty and the kinds of things they ask. First of all, what is SoTL? Why do we call it Scholarship of Teaching and Learning? Why does it matter? Why should it matter to me as a faculty member, as somebody who's doing a lot of teaching, to my students, to others? If I decide that it's something that's of interest, how do I get started? How do I, possibly as a researcher from another discipline, come up with a good question? And I can certainly give examples on that. I started out in the natural sciences. I worked in a biochemistry lab. I'm now a qualitative educational researcher. So there's been lots of transitions in my own academic path. Where can I find existing research? Again, acknowledging that it might be that I'm looking for research in a discipline that's not really related to a home discipline. What kinds of things should you think about the approach you might take to the research? So we'll talk about how do you take a research approach that builds on your skills and your knowledge and the kinds of research you do, but it also helps you richly answer the question you might pose. How do you collect and analyze data, and what kinds of data might you collect? Are there cautions? Are there lessons to be learned from others who have done this kind of work? Where can you read more about it? And down the road, how can you make your own work public? What are the various ways in which that might be done? So I want to pause for a moment. What additional questions might be on your mind, even before we begin? And I'm going to suggest that we're not a very large group, that if you have any, you just go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, for me, one question that I have is, if I'm trying to do qualitative study, right, for which, for example, indigenous ways of knowing and kind of trying to incorporate that, right, there's not a whole lot of, in terms of evidence-based practice that's out there. And so what's the methodology, or how do we even kind of approach those kind of topics? This sounds a bit like evidence-based practice, kind of implementing that in kind of doing the research. So the qualitative stuff, I'm a bit, I'm interested in those areas, but how do I even begin?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I will be spending some time talking about qualitative as well as blended methods, but I think, we're all products of our own scholarly upbringing, so to speak. And so when we talk about evidence-based practice, it's maybe expanding the notion in the literature of what is evidence. So Indigenous ways of knowing is evidence-based practice, just not as we might research it. And you're right, there's a real gap of findable literature about that, because a lot of those cultures aren't cultures that write about it, they speak about it. So I'll come back to that. Thank you so much, Abdul. Anybody else? Yes, go ahead, Titania.
Yeah, I have actually two questions. One of the questions is scholarship in teaching and learning now it's gaining the tracks, of course, but many people are still skeptical. Exceptionally, I would say it's true about physics, mathematics, science. People just don't really take it seriously very often. So what is your suggestion is to work to overcome this? And that's my first question. My second question is, I come from physics education research, and physics education research is really rooted in physics. So my second question is how to reconcile sometimes the needs for to be more subject specific, but at the same time, just to cover some basic things that come with SoTL.
Great. I so appreciate that question. You'll be delighted to know that there's tons of research on classroom teaching and learning in physics. In fact, of all the disciplines, physics internationally probably led the way. It isn't always called SoTL. It's sometimes called discipline-based educational research. There are lots of people doing it, and a couple of my examples today are from the sciences. So
I'm sorry, I don't think you understood my question. I know about physics education research, that's my field.
Okay.
My question is how to reconcile with the general SoTL.
Okay, so in terms of building a bridge to people in other disciplines, I made a note. Can I come back to that?
Sure,
yeah. The slides and where we might elaborate a bit more on that, if that's okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Sure.
All right. Any others? Because then I can make notes and make sure that I weave things into our conversations. Okay, let's carry on for now, and there will be a number of chances where we'll stop and have discussion about points. So, okay, what is it? There's lots of definitions in the literature. Some international colleagues and I have just submitted a paper on why defining it tightly is an issue of exclusion, that the more tightly we define scholarship of teaching and learning, the more people feel left out. And so that may not be very helpful to those who are trying to get a grasp of what is this field about. So I prefer to think about it in fairly broad terms, that it is across any discipline. It's any kind of inquiring into the processes of teaching and learning with the intention of improving our understanding and improving student learning. It doesn't therefore necessarily, although it says underneath it makes the results public, but it doesn't necessarily do that. I could do scholarship of teaching and learning simply by examining something in my own classroom and applying the results to my own teaching. That traditionally has been looked at as more scholarly teaching, but the definitions are changing. And so SoTL can be in any discipline the processes of doing some kind of inquiry into student learning, into teaching, and into trying to make things better because of it. So coming back to the question about physics, those of us around the globe who are promoting SoTL would say that what you're describing about discipline-based research in physics is indeed SoTL. I still get the issue of how do you make other people see it that way, because not everybody does. There's a lot of discussion still that of this notion, this metaphor of the big tent, that there's space for everybody in it. But again, I think it's easy to see the people who aren't there. For example, although we are starting to get researchers from the African continent, there's not a lot in the literature that calls research about teaching and learning from that continent scholarship of teaching and learning. There's not nearly enough from our Indigenous colleagues around the world, not just in North America. So the old definition, scholarly teaching, was when we went and looked in the literature or talked to colleagues to say, hey, I've got a problem, what can I do about this? And we came up with an idea and we tried it. Whereas with the scholarship of teaching and learning, we use some kind of study. And I know the slide says empirical, but I think it could be reflective study. It doesn't necessarily have to collect survey data or things from students. It could be our own reflections as our empirical evidence. But the intention is to improve practice. And you can make the results public in brackets. I would argue that if you make them public to your students, that's one way of going public. So have I confused you yet? I mean, it's a good start. All right. Nancy Fenton and her colleagues from McMaster did a great guidebook, and I provide the reference later on about some of the sort of really straightforward, how do you get started, and the kinds of questions you might ask. That you would start with framing the question. Not just what's the topic of your inquiry, but how do you frame the question in a way that you can research it? Then what evidence do you gather and analyze, and how do you go about then testing it in the classroom to see if you can make it better? And then finally, in some form or other, making it public. So if I say to my students, would you prefer to have 3 readings a week or 2? And they give me an answer. I suppose I framed the question, I've gathered the evidence, I could analyze that evidence. I don't know that I'm going to test it and refine it in the classroom. I might make a change. I might say, yeah, I disagree with you anyway for these reasons. And I'm probably not going to make the results public. So I think there's lots of inquiry in one way or another that we do in our teaching all the time. We probably engage in inquiry every time we redo a syllabus for a course we've taught 10 times to say, do I still want to keep those readings? Can I find some that are better representation of diverse scholars? All those kinds of things, but they're not necessarily SoTL. We haven't done something that gets us into an action research cycle where we find out what the issue is, we collect evidence, and then we seek to improve it. So the seeking to improve it is really the key focus for scholarship of teaching and learning. Okay, lots on here. Most of it is a quote just because I liked some of the phrasing from this piece from Nancy and colleagues' book, that notion of an animating force. So what they're talking about is, where do our questions in SoTL come from? The idea that something's difficult in a classroom. For me, years of teaching only graduate students, it would be, why can't I get the graduate students to write, obviously in brackets, the way I'd like them to? A sense that something is going differently than what it should be, and that might be better or not as good as we'd like it to. So one of my projects was based on a assignment I gave students to, instead of just critiquing a scholarly paper, they had to find a Wikipedia page that was related to the course, critique that, and improve it using the scholarly literature. And the something that went other than what I thought it would was the amount of personal transformation they had through the assignment. And it has sparked a 5-year-long research study, which is more or less wrapping up now, looking at the ways in which one assignment can develop graduate degree level expectations and employability skills. So it's been quite interesting because something didn't go, it was a surprise. So wherever there's a surprise in teaching, so it could be a success, it could be a failure, it just could be something that you want to give more attention to. One of the things I've always said to faculty colleagues when I'm working with them on SoTL is, what is it in your teaching that takes longer than you would like? And could you use a SoTL study to help you save time? And that sounds very self-serving, and it is. But I think it's reasonable to be self-serving in COVID times especially, and also because doing a project in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning will take you some time. So there are advantages in seeing if you can use it to save time in your teaching. And then the next step, of course, and here's one, the question about SoTL versus discipline-based research. In our discipline, when we come up with a question, I think it's been trained into us to go into the literature and see what's been done. I find sometimes when people are doing scholarship of teaching and learning, because maybe it's not a familiar field, it's awfully common for people to skip the step of going into the literature. And I think providing you with points of entry that will make that easier is part of what I'm interested in doing. So again, I have some resources that streamline that, and I strongly suggest make friends with your institutional librarian if you have not already. Librarians at my institution seem to be lonely people that, not really, but they love to be asked how to find stuff pertaining to topics. So do make use of that if you can. So I'm going to pull up a short video, and let's just see, this usually just takes a moment to load. This is, Pat Huber is one of the founders really of the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and she talks a little bit about what kinds of questions are reasonable questions. Just bear with me. It's a little clunky when it's on screen share. Here we go. All right, here we don't. One moment.
I should begin by saying that this came out of the work of the Carnegie Academy for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. And though people often attribute it to me, it really was a product of the collective work of the program, and Lee Schulman, certainly, Mary Huber, all of us working together. And it has been more suggestive to people than I could ever have imagined. So here's how it goes. It could have more pieces than this, but in its simplest version. A first kind of question is an "is it working" question. And this is where I think a lot of faculty begin. They're trying something new in their teaching, and they want to know, is it working? Is it achieving the goal, the goals, the learning that they're aiming for? They're using problem-based learning for the first time, and they want to know whether it's meeting their goals for student learning. So it's an "is it working" question. But another kind of question is a "what does it look like" question. We had folks in the Castle program who started out with a "is it working" question, and then realized that they didn't even really know what they were looking for. And so they began instead with a kind of descriptive question, just looking at what went on, say, in a seminar. How do you even describe the dynamics of a seminar and the kind of intellectual community that characterizes a seminar and makes it a seminar rather than something else? So they developed a kind of descriptive framework for thinking about a seminar. And then they could ask an "is it working" question. The descriptive question was really a prior one. A related third kind of question is a sort of "what would it look like" question. That is to say, what would it look like if I were to teach this course in a completely different way that I at least have never taught it, and that would be really sort of new for the field. One of the folks in the Castle program was teaching abnormal psychology, and she got onto the notion, this was at least 10 years ago, that rather than teaching it as a course in all the kinds of psychological problems people could have, it would be more useful for her students to teach it as a course about resilience, sort of the positive psychology spin, which was newer then than it is now. That was a wholly different way to teach that course at the time. And there were many more interesting details there, but it was a real shift in the vision of what such a course could look like. And finally, I'll stop at 4. The fourth kind of question was really sort of a theory or concept building kind of question, where the notion was to build a different way of making meaning out of the things that teachers and students do together in the classroom. And an example there was the work of a faculty member in English who was looking at how students and faculty think about moments of difficulty in the classroom. She wasn't asking, does it work? She wasn't asking, what does it look like? She was really theorizing about difficulty and helping all of us who have moments of difficulty in the classroom think about how to make sense of that.
So does that lead you at all to thinking about what kinds of questions there might be? And, you know, when I listen to Pat Hutchings talk, I think, oh, there's questions I'm sure that don't quite fall within her categories. And you might think of some of those as well. So I'm not going to say 5 to 10 questions. This was originally intended as an activity people might do on their own later. But I think it might be interesting to write down 1 or 2 questions right now that you might explore, whether or not they're what you intend to propose for a teaching fellowship or just things you'd like to explore, to write down a couple. When you have time later, or even just, on the drive, think about if you're driving or on the subway, think about what other questions might be related to that. Because sometimes it's hard to see our own question well. And to see several questions written down, sometimes a theme pops up that can make us go, oh, okay, this is what I'm actually trying to ask. And I can't recommend enough the idea of getting feedback from a partner. I would say preferably one outside your discipline, and perhaps ideally one who's not an academic, to see whether just the basic logic of what you're thinking is making sense. And I know that that may sound a little odd that I'm recommending that, but I certainly have had the experience of getting great feedback from people who are not within my discipline. So they're not following the same well-worn tire ruts that I am. They have a different perspective on things. So I want to pause my chat for a moment, and I wonder if anybody would like to share a potential question, so we could hear some variety of the kinds of questions and topics that might be on people's minds. And again, if you'd like to just speak out, that would be fine. And I just add to that to make sure that as we go along, that we give chance for everybody to speak. Go ahead.
I don't know if I can go. I don't mind going first. I think for me, again, I teach social work, and I teach anti-racist and anti-oppressive practices. So the big question for me always that's very, very challenging is what's the most effective way to teach anti-oppressive or anti-racist social work? Because these are very touchy topics. And so over the years, I've tried different ways, and but I don't even quite know. Sometimes it's a hit and miss, and sometimes students are engaged, other times students are divided, sometimes students walk away. Yeah, so those are the kind of things I think top of my mind.
So some comments about that, and I hope people will be okay if I just give some what comes to me off the top of my head. The notion of what's the most effective way can be a big question to try and address, right? Because sometimes, or arguably all the time, that's context specific. And so what might be the best way in one context might not equally work in our own. But I heard some other words that might guide you to a narrower focus that might help you. And that was the notion of the extent to which students are engaged or divided. I'm not sure if that second word was correct, by what you do. And that, to be able to assess how the students are responding to what we are doing, gives us something that's a little bit more bounded within our own practice. So absolutely, one can go into the literature and see what are some of the ways people are finding it work, and then say, okay, which of those can I use, and how can I assess not just do the students like them or not, are they engaged or not, and perhaps are they learning better or not. And so in any social sciences and humanities, many of us have had the experience where the students don't necessarily love what we're doing, but boy, do they remember it. And so, there's some trying to balance all of that. So Abdul, those are just a couple of thoughts that came to me based on your really interesting question. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I've done a bit of research, and what I find is different, like in my own lived experiences in terms of attending various workshops, some start with the history of colonization and then come to the point. Others talk about, the socialization and upbringing of the white folk from a whiteness perspective, white supremacy perspective, and how racism perpetuates. Some talk about the institution. So yeah, I'm trying to struggle with, you're right, it's a huge question and I'm still struggling.
And, one of the things that is being proposed more and more, not just in scholarship of teaching and learning, but in teaching in general, is ways in which we might work with students as partners to assist us with course design, to assist us with not just as participants in our research, but as people who might be co-researchers, who might have a really great take on their experience that comes into the research. So something to think about there as well. I wonder if someone has another example.
I think I can ask a question. First of all, thank you very much for this beautiful presentation so far. And my question is, I always interested to add or remove parts of my lecture components or my teaching components to see how it works. Sometimes I ask whether, for example, the shorter video versus the longer video have an effect, or whether the format of the video have an effect. For example, you can think of different formats of videos, or a simple activity instead of regular routine teaching. What's the effect on student engagement or learning or retention or retrieval of information? That is another thing that I see, and I always do a poll in the class, but I haven't published anything so far. So I can give you those examples as a specific question, specific activity, and its effect on student learning, on a student performance, on a student retrieval information later on. So those are kind of specific aims that I can think of right now.
Very nice. Thank you, Hussein. And what discipline are you teaching in?
I am with chemistry and biology. I'm teaching biological sciences.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Now, when I'm on screen share, I'm limited from seeing everybody's hands. Jim, I see your hands up. So I'll go to you, and then others will have to help me know that the hand is up.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm in chemistry, and my background is as an environmental chemist, and I teach first year chemistry here at the university. And we're right around midterm season where students are starting to get their first set of marks back. And one of the interventions that I use when students are disappointed with maybe the mark that they've gotten back is to show them their academic family tree and go through all of the different famous chemists that are part of their tree that they now join, in a hope that I can promote a greater sense of belonging among my students. Because in addition to being a chemist, I've spent about 15 years working in and living in university residences. And so I see what an impact a sense of belonging has on people's transition to university. So I'm really interested in how certain interventions that I might try to employ or that others employ impact belonging, and then eventually student success.
Nice. I'm excited because I'm doing some research right now on a course assignment where I partnered my students with external academic partners, and my grad students researched a topic in SoTL for an external partner. And one of the things that's come out of that, I'm working with one of the students as a research partner. She said, oh, it was so motivating. Everybody's comments are about motivation. And so she uncovered the links around relatedness and its importance in motivation. That is, so this is cool. This is cool. And it gets at, it almost doesn't matter what discipline we're in, there's common threads across a lot of these, right? Thanks for that, Jim. Who else? Tom.
Hi, thank you. So I teach in hospitality and tourism within the business school, and I teach one of the big first year classes. So typically in regular times is up to 300 students. And very roughly, there's three main groups. There's domestic first year students that are about 100. There's international first year students that range between 50 and 100. And then there's upper years taking it as an elective from all across the university. And so I'm kind of, it's a big mix. And I guess I'm curious about the student experience aspect of it. And how do you, I instinctively try to give a class that meets different needs at different levels, but I'm kind of curious to kind of research that a bit more and how to, meet different needs and different interests and different levels all in the one class. And the other question I'm kind of curious about is like the ethics of, researching your own teaching and students within the, and so that, like, I'm kind of curious about that too. How do you say, are you having a good time in my class? Or I'm controlling your grades? So that's another question I have too.
So I will thank you for all of that. I'll definitely touch on some ethics questions and guidelines and issues later. I mean, the short answer is all of us can certainly collect feedback about our teaching at any time, assuming that it's for our personal use to improve our teaching. As soon as we go to publish it, we have to have ethics. But I don't know that always is ethical enough, if you see what I mean. I used to have 6 data points through the term of just asking students how one or another thing was going. I'm probably down most terms. I'm 2 or 3 now. I've just asked my classes for, you know, how is this online course going? Are there things that you would like me to do differently? Are there things that you would like me to continue doing? Is there anything else you want to tell me? I'm not going to publish that. But there are some years I look at what they say and think, oh, I wish I'd asked for ethics permission. This would be great to publish. So it's bridging that gap, I guess. But there's lots of ways of assessing students. And I guess the question is determining, is there something you're already doing that over the next time you do it, you want to go through ethics beforehand so that you have the option of publishing any data you might get. Yeah. Anybody else before we move on?
I have a quick one for you. If I can, I don't know if my camera's working, but
That's okay. Curtis, right?
yes.
Excellent.
Oh, here now it says use video. Okay, there I am. Hello. So the question, it's pretty specific, but the question is, it's a what would it look like kind of question. So what would it look like to include Indigenous guest speakers in my curriculum as a non-Indigenous professor in ways that are reciprocal and relational rather than extractive of Indigenous knowledge? So the question makes some assumptions about what that would look like, but I'm curious to know what you think of that.
I think that's a fascinating question. And, you know, these questions are of increasing importance as our minds are turned to that. I know colleagues who have done really great jobs of co-designing courses with Indigenous partners, colleagues who were not Indigenous, who worked with Indigenous partners from the community to design courses. And in one example, a past colleague of mine who since passed on, worked with somebody to design a course nationally to help Indigenous students navigate the medical school application process. What they were finding was that the Indigenous students did not do well, or as well as would be expected for their skills, in the rapid fire sort of speed dating form of interview that was being used for some medical schools. And so he worked with the Indigenous community to create a short program to help people navigate that. And I think the key for a lot of this is in partnership with. So how do we put all our cards on the table? You know, if I'm working with an Indigenous speaker and I'm honored to have colleagues who will come and talk to my classes, it's not me saying, could you come and talk about this? It's me saying, this is what my course is about. I would really like to have this kind of perspective. What would you like to talk about? And so I do it in that way, and I'm very disclosed to the students that that's the way it was done. So I guess the question there is, it sounds like a cool practice. So how do you set it up as research?
Yeah, and the data on the one hand, like, you know, I'm interested in how the students are experiencing the course. On the other hand, I'm interested in how the guests are experiencing their time in the course. So in terms of, you know, structuring the research for that, am I looking at both sides? Is that sort of the idea, is to be getting feedback from both? Yeah.
So I have a study, the study that, I mean, to call it a study, it seems so straightforward to me, is the one where I had the students partnered with external academic partners. We just asked the students and the partners, how did that go for you? And out of that very broad question, there were a couple sub questions, looked at what were the common themes. So we're working on the final paper for that right now.
So it can be fairly anecdotal then, like if I was to speak to the experience of the guests based on kind of talking to them.
Absolutely. And it really depends where you go with it. So if you end up with, you know, you might find some themes that are a bit of a surprise that, you know, or maybe you talk about how people's boundaries were expanded or whatever it is that comes out of it. It's really, as much as anything, what you make of that. So find out what's been done already. You might in the literature find that people have some great ways of approaching the questions that would surround the idea of what was your experience of. Okay.
Okay, that's great.
These are fascinating questions. I love that they seem to be, although they're based in disciplines, they almost seem to be independent of the discipline. They're questions that have really broad implications. And I think that for me is what excited me when I came to the field of scholarship of teaching and learning, because my academic career is more like a checkerboard. You know, I'm obviously old, I have gray hair, I'm an assistant prof because I'm late to the field of education. But I love that with scholarship of teaching and learning, it's multi and interdisciplinary, and many of the questions seem to be being asked by people in completely different disciplines. So those were some thoughts on what kinds of questions. Oh, just one sec. Hang on a second there. We froze for a moment. So I mentioned that finding the existing research is really important. And some of the places you might look. So there are peer-reviewed SoTL journals. There's lots of them. I've included here so that you can have a look at it later. The slides will be posted. The Canadian Journal, where you will find projects ranging from classroom-based or course-based scholarship of teaching and learning, projects that are department level, projects that are institutional level, and in some cases, work that, say, I and colleagues tend to do more these days, which is kind of an umbrella meta view of what's happening in the field of the scholarship of teaching and learning. So there's examples of every level. You will probably be looking for course-based research, but you'll find lots in here. Again, make friends with your librarian. And I will direct you to the resource at the top. This was something that I started, oh gosh, over a decade ago. I was working at Waterloo as the person supporting scholarship of teaching and learning, and found over and over and over again, our profs didn't know where to start to find research. So this is a open access website. I've had my graduate students create brief annotations, and I held them to 100 words on usually 3 to 4 articles for each topic. These topics range through everything you can imagine, and we've tried to start tagging the articles by discipline. Anyway, have a look, because chances are in the 100+ topics that what you're interested in reviewing is, you know, there's stuff about student engagement, there's stuff about Indigenous ways of knowing, there's stuff about online learning, there's stuff about diversity, there's stuff about assessing students, all kinds of things in there. So have a look, just to give you some starting points for where you can hone and fine tune the question you may have. Okay, folks, so how on earth do we find what method we might use, given that there are so darn many? And this is not intended to be an exhaustive list, but because we often are within our own disciplinary lens, perhaps this will suggest to you some options that you might not have thought about. So within the quantitative paradigms, the idea of correlational, to what extent does this factor relate to another one? An experimental design where we're testing a hypothesis and collecting the data around that. Descriptive statistics, where all we're really saying is this is the state of the land. And then the notion of causal comparative, which is rarer, because when working with human subjects, it's pretty difficult to prove that this factor caused this result. And I'll give you a slightly comic example of that. At Waterloo, first year engineering asked if I could please look at why they'd had a sudden blip, a downward blip, and a fairly significant one in student retention. And they thought that it was based on the year that we had the double cohort. That was the year they noticed this challenge started. They'd never had problems before. And suddenly the rate of retention had gotten really quite poor following the double cohort. And so we did focus groups, and we talked to the senior TAs, and we talked to some of the students and collected lots of data and said, you know, really there were identified some things that the students would like to see done differently, but we couldn't point to what it was that might have caused this. And the then chair of first year engineering wasn't happy with this finding and said, well, you know, there has to be something in this. And did you ask about the age, and is it because they're immature? And we said, that's not what we're seeing. And I knew him pretty well. And I said, well, is there anything else that happened in that same year? And he said, well, I became chair of the program. And I said, well, then clearly it's because of you. And obviously I was kidding, but the point is you can't always isolate what has caused a phenomenon. So you see some studies like that in SoTL, not as many. In terms of the qualitative paradigms, ethnography, looking at the culture that around a class could be interesting. You know, why is the class I teach in one course a certain way one year and I teach the same course the next year and it's completely different? Could be because I'm different, but quite often it's because there's some dynamic in the class that's going on. Grounded theory, where maybe I don't really know what's going on and I just go in to see what's happening and see if I can build theory from the data I find. Using your course as a case study, doing narrative accounts, perhaps having students journaling. And Hossein, I'll come to you in just a moment. The distinction between phenomenography and phenomenology, where phenomenography is looking for variations in patterns. Phenomenology is looking for the essence that's at the center of something. And I can give you examples of those. Hermeneutics, where we might, for example, be interpreting students' written work. Action research, where we make a change and go in and improve something and reassess it. Curriculum design, arts-based. I've done some, I have a previous background as an art college graduate, so I do a fair bit of arts-based data collection as well. Hossein, let me come to your question, please.
Oh yeah, you mentioned something here that it reminded me of a big question that I have all the time. You mentioned that from one semester to another semester, the data, the outcome of the same activity might be different.
Yes.
And that is one thing that I learned, and also talked to a number of people who are in the field of SoTL and the BEAR, and they were telling me the same thing. Every year, the culture is different, students are different, and therefore the same procedure or method might not work for one group, but works perfectly for another group. My question is, when you come to this kind of data collection and publication, what that means? That means that, you know what I mean, in science, because I'm coming from biomedical science, when you create the data and reproducibility is there, you trust that data, and that is something that you know it better than me. But when it comes to collecting data that works in some group of students, doesn't work for another student, or work more or less on other students, what are we learning here other than that we always need to change our methodology when we're dealing with new cohort of students? I mean, when you compare science kind of research, biological, biomedical kind of research with this kind of research, I get a little bit confused how far we can go with this kind of research.
Yeah, and I think I love the question about what are we learning from it. I mean, I think what I'm learning when I see that is there's factors I haven't figured out. There's hidden factors. So, you know, this may not be the best illustration of what you're talking about, but it comes to mind is when I look at my the average score of my teaching evaluations over my courses. So I have I'm in a teaching professor type role. I teach 8 half courses a year. So over the 12 or so years just that I've been at Brock full time, I've got a lot of teaching data. And I look back at the data and I think, oh my goodness, what happened that term and that term? And I can identify, I've got 3 low terms in that time where the findings from those surveys, and I'm just looking at the average, they stand out to me as a little bit lower. And then I go, oh, that's the term after my close colleague died. Oh, that's the term when this happened at home. That's the term when this happened. So I can look at it and say the data is telling me that there was something else significant going on. What I don't know is what's significant going on for the students. So I think it could be fascinating. For example, you know, what's the effect of COVID on student evaluations of teaching? Is there an effect? What would it take to mitigate a potential downward effect from their stress? How we might do that. But as somebody who started out as a science researcher, I know exactly where you're coming from. It's sort of a, well, wait a minute, we're not counting anything here. It's an interpretation, and maybe we can't even interpret everything that's involved. I think I like it because it's difficult, because it's messy. And I quite like that aspect of it. But yes, it means that we're much more, the people who do qualitative research are, I think, not exclusively, but much more cautious about claims in the papers. So, you know, the data indicate that. They don't prove, they don't disprove, they indicate that. And so there is speculation. And I think rather than replicating, it's more likely in qualitative work that somebody picks up the work and then says, okay, what ought to come next to see if we can narrow down what factors are at play. So I don't know if that helps, but yes, I live in a messy world. I like it.
Me too. Thank you very much.
Okay. And so obviously mixed methods, blends of the above, and then commonly used ways of collecting data in SoTL, surveys, either quantitative or qualitative, focus groups, interviews, student journals, e-portfolios, sometimes grades. And I say sometimes grades, that comes back to the ethics question, because students have strongly personal views about their grades and how those could be used. We would have to, of course, get ethics approval to use them. So it's not so much an anything goes, because what I want to come back to is you have to have an approach that matches the question you want to ask. I remember talking with a faculty member from economics while I was at Waterloo, and I can't to this day recall what the original question was they were proposing asking for their SoTL study. But they said to me, I have to do a regression analysis. And the question, the way it was framed, was not suited to a regression analysis at all. It was suited to a more open-ended qualitative type study. And I was explaining this to the faculty member, and they looked at me and said, to be published in this journal of economics, if I don't have a regression analysis, it won't be published. And so we spent some time deciding, do you change the question so that you can go with that? Or do you stay with the question, find a different approach, and choose a different journal to publish the work? And in the end, they wanted to make a difference. They wanted their impact to be in economics. So they tweaked their question until they could use a statistical based way of approaching it. So it's something to think about. If you are in the notion of quantitative, how do you ask a question that allows you to apply the kinds of research that are familiar and comfortable? If you're used to doing qualitative, do you want to stay with that? Do you want to work with a partner from a different discipline who may bring a completely different approach, and you blend the best of them together? That's a thing to think about as you go forward. So here's one example. I worked with a chemistry professor who had 190 students in a second year chemistry class, face-to-face class. And the professor, this is before online learning was quite as common as it is now, but she wanted to have the students engage in learning communities and to do that online, because as she said, this is the way we work as chemists. And so it should reinforce that having colleagues as resources is valuable. She wanted to set up discussion groups so the students would start to learn from each other as well as her. And so her research was to find out how to do the groups and what works and doesn't work in setting up these groups. And this was sort of a study within a study, because while she was doing this and collecting evidence of how did the grades change, and it was a really simple design. She gave 5% for participation in the online groups. She had a research assistant, or sorry, she had a teaching assistant who was just assigned to go and look at people's online comments. And she looked at to what extent did that 5% either allow the student's mark to stay as it would have been expected, or raise it or lower it. And what she found was at the C and D level, the students went up. The A level students, they do everything. Doesn't really change what they're doing. And the students who are completely disengaged for whatever reason, it doesn't change. But at the C and D level right there, there was this upward blip, and she's working on a second phase of the study. While she was doing that quantitative piece, I was doing research on what happens when a professor tries to implement online learning communities. And so the data that I had was our conversations every couple of months through the academic term of what she learned. And my findings were that at the beginning, and this won't surprise anybody, At the beginning, she was very focused on the logistical. How do we get this set up? How do we make it work? Around midterm, she started thinking about what was working for the students and how she communicated with them. And towards the end of the term, she started thinking about her own development as an educator and what she had learned through the process. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but it is the process of Mesereau's transformative learning, and that she had evidence in her conversation and her journals of that over the term. So it was sort of an interesting blended study looking at the both. So we each went through ethics to get ethics permission, in my case, with one participant to look at her process over the term, in her case, with her class of students so that she could examine their grades to see what the change was. So what kinds of evidence are going to answer the question you have? Each of she and I had very, very different kinds of evidence. For me to say what was her process of reflective practice over the term, it wouldn't have helped me necessarily to count anything in that, to collect quantitative data, but nor would it have helped her necessarily to collect qualitative data, to ask the students, how did you feel about the online learning communities? Wouldn't have helped her answer her question of, did it assist them with their academic success? And her, as I say, her phase one didn't give her the whole answer, but it told her which direction to go in. You have to also think about what is your skill level, your comfort level, and what resources are available. To me, resources is, yes, partly did you get a teaching grant or did you get some other support, but it should also be, do you have the time and do you have the capacity to do it? And so how small can you make the project if necessary so that you can complete it? And then if, as my economics colleague wanted to do, you want to make an impact in your discipline, you should ask what kind of evidence will be acceptable within your discipline. So circling back to the notion, whether it's physics or whatever sciences, if you want to publish it in a physics education journal or ChemEd or whatever, you have to have a look at that journal and see what are the kinds of things they publish. And am I framing my project in a way that it would be publishable in that? If, on the other hand, you're thinking about, oh, I might want to present this at the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Ed conference. That comes up in June each year in Canada. Or I want to join the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. In those kinds of conference settings, because people are coming from every discipline, it really won't matter whether what you have collected and analyzed is acceptable within your discipline. As long as you followed a good process, and we'll talk about that briefly, it will get into the conference and you'll have a good audience for it. So again, let me pause for a moment to see what questions anybody may have just at this stage. Okay, I'm going to give you a couple more examples. Data don't make sense, we have to resort to statistics. Hopefully not. I wanted to give you an example of coding. So here's how I, with a originally quantitative brain, but now a qualitative approach, deal with data. A colleague and I did this study. It was an international study. We were asking questions of people who support scholarship of teaching and learning at their institution. We had faculty members, we had educational developers, we had administrators, we had students, and we had a couple who identified as other. And we were overwhelmed as well as pleasantly surprised by how much data we got. So we did not expect having 75 respondents, and we did not expect having mini essays in response to most of our questions. So, you know, we had questions like, what factors at your institution support scholarship of teaching and learning? What factors impede it? What evidence do you collect? And you can see we asked them how they made it public, whether it was at a micro level, that is just to their own class, a meso level to their department, a macro level to the whole institution, or a mega level being beyond, whether that was disciplinary or interdisciplinary. And this is a small piece of my Excel sheet. So I went through, and my colleagues separately went through, and we coded each of the responses for what we thought were the 2 or 3 keywords that stood out. And then she and I met to discuss our very separate lists of keywords to say, were we talking about the same thing using different words? And so we arrived at the labels of, you see leadership, role, culture, resources, community, and personal. And then I color coded them because I'm an art college graduate, remember? So I see things in color, it stood out for me. And then I assigned each of them a numerical value so we could do some statistical analysis on this large data set. It's been fascinating. The paper we published out of it had both numeric and excerpts from some of their little pieces that they wrote in. So you might not do that as a way of coding. I'm sure you have other ways. I tend to like color coding. I get transcripts on screen and I just computer highlight things that stand out to me and pertain to themes that I'm looking for. But I suspect you will have ways that work for you. And if not, you may have ways that you've heard colleagues describe or that you've seen other people do. Again, it's just making sure that what you're doing is making sense for the question that you're trying to answer. So some other considerations. Yes, back to ethics. So before any data are collected, you need to go through your ethics process. And some of the questions that come up typically with scholarship of teaching and learning are confidentiality versus anonymity. So do you want to collect data from your students in a way that's anonymous? And I think, although that's considered, so to speak, the gold standard for data collection, think about it carefully. With the project, and I don't know, I lost my brain for that day, the project where I had students partnered with external partners, I collected anonymous data through a web-based survey. Well, that of course meant we couldn't match the student to the external partner. So when people made specific comments, we didn't know whether the comment really pertained to that specific partnership. So it wasn't a great choice actually for that project, but it might be perfectly fine for others. If you want to do surveys that are, say, paper-based and you're going to be in class, you might choose to have somebody else administer the survey. So in some circumstances, I've had students hand out the survey and then put it in a sealed envelope. The student holds that, or we give it to an administrative assistant to hold until the marks are submitted. So the students know that nothing they write about will be, it can't be taken into account when any grading is done. So there are different ways that you could do an arm's length data collection. Or in a course that I wasn't intending to do a study, but about halfway through the course, the students approached me and said, this course is different from any course we've ever taken and we're fascinated by that. And they're education graduate students. So I said, well, if you like, we could have a brief meeting now to discuss whether or not we'd like to do a research study after the grades are submitted. And that's what we did. We talked about what the possibilities might be. We polled the class to see who might be interested. And then in the week following grade submission, an email went out to those people to say, are you still interested? We're going to start the study now. So lots of different ways of doing it. One of the things that ethics boards are, I think, quite reasonably concerned about is if you were to go into your teaching with an idea that you maybe had derived from the literature that a specific way of doing things was better for learning, then the ethics board would say, well, every student has the right to benefit from that method. And so one of the ways of setting that up is to organize your course so that you divide your class, say, into two. Or maybe you're lucky enough to have two sections of the same course, but anyway, you divide the class and you say, okay, section A gets that method for weeks 1, 2, and 3, and then they get a different method for weeks 4, 5, 6, and you flip it with the other class. Or if you only have one class, I'm going to try this intervention in weeks 6, 7, and 8, and then I will make sure that I have some either exam questions. If you have an exam on the final exam, I'll make sure I have things organized so that I can correlate them to the content for that particular set of weeks so that you can see whether there's been a significant effect. So again, things to think about. It doesn't mean it's not doable. Regarding funding, and whether that's for the teaching fellowship or for other funding sources you may find, funders want to know that your question is relevant beyond your own course. So what kinds of deliverables will come out of this, whether this be, be the knowledge, of course, but what else might come out of it that will benefit the community? So maybe you make a YouTube video that's relevant, that shares your findings, or maybe there's something that you can offer as a workshop for others. What is it that you can give back? And we're increasingly seeing this in funding, that the knowledge mobilization is a big deal. So what are your plans for not just collecting this data and writing about it, but making it public in more ways? And have you established that what you're doing is different from what others are? So again, that's what we see a lot. And sometimes there are still papers coming into the SoTL journals or conferences where you think, oh my goodness, this has been done and done and done, and this is no different from it. So have a look, go and be informed, get the librarian involved, say, I'm thinking of this. Can you help me find what else has been done on that, so that you're not reinventing the wheel, but instead you can build on other people's work. Before I go to the implementing, can I just pause there for questions or comments? Questions about ethics that you might have that I didn't touch on, or funding? Let me see, I see a couple more chat questions. So I'm just, okay, we lost somebody to course, but that's fine, okay. Nothing? So far, so good?
Yes, for me, I guess I'm not used to writing these funding application or ethics, especially. But sometimes the funding and the application can be mind-boggling in terms of the strict requirements and the rules and the regulations around it. I find that sometimes intimidating and kind of almost does not even, like, forget it. I don't have the time for it, and I don't want to go through it. So I'm not sure what your experience is, or if you can give us some like, how do you cope with this? Because I just look at that requirement, I go, I cannot be bothered. Forget it. I walk away.
Oh, it so resonates with me. I've been really, really successful with smaller research grants. I mean, really successful. And then when I sat down a couple summers ago, I thought, oh, this would be worth going after SSHRC to get some money to support this. It was my entire summer to write the grant proposal and to get feedback from people and tweak it and go, oh my goodness, now I have to change that. Oh my goodness, I thought it was under the words, but I've got to. It just felt incredibly onerous. I didn't get the money, no surprise. And I stopped when they said at my institution, well, we can support you reapplying. I thought, I'm just going to go ahead and do the work, because really I can do it without much money, and I'd rather get the work done. So that's not a very helpful response, but the things that have helped, and I think, interestingly, I think ethics applications can be the same in terms of the rules that are there, feeling like you're trying to shoehorn things into a space that they may or may not easily fit. I think if you view it as a way of understanding how well you know your project, that if something's difficult to answer, it may mean that that part of the project is not as well fleshed out for you. And I found that when I reframed it like that for myself, instead of, swearing under my breath at the funding application, I could say, oh, okay, I don't actually know yet what it is I want to do here. I need to go away and think about that and read something else or talk to somebody. Get input from others, have other people have a look at it. And I don't know, Sarah, I might be dropping you into something here, but whether Sarah has examples, get examples of other people's work that have been successful in terms of both ethics and applying for funding. So have a look at proposals to see, can you use it as a bit of a template that you might write to? It's a thought about that. I did that for my first article that was published. I looked at the journal I wanted to go to. I downloaded 3 of the articles that I had cited, and I did a quantitative analysis of the length of each section. I labeled my sections the same, and I wrote to that template. So when the journal got it, it felt like something they might publish. And I don't know if that's the only reason that it got accepted, but it seemed to work well. Hussein. Oh, you're still muted.
I have 2 questions. Question number 1 is, you're saying that if I am teaching a course, during the course, I realize that I'm interested to collect a sort of data. For example, I'm teaching a section and I like to, the way that you explained it, I want to divide in 2 sections, half of the class exposed to that specific treatment, and then I switch it to the other side, as you said, something like randomized controlled trial or something like crossover studies. So now I'm done with that. I collected the data. You're saying that after that, I can apply for REB and use that information. So what I'm trying to say is that, can I collect data without REB first? No, I can't. Okay.
You have to go through REB first. There are rare examples where you might be able to say to REB, this thing happened that was unanticipated, and I'd like to now ask the students about it. But to go in and consciously make that division and say, I'm doing it this way, now go through REB, I suspect, you know, they would metaphorically slap our wrists for that. Most of the REB statements say no interaction with participants until they've come through with a positive review.
Okay. And my second question is it's a general question. Do we have a nationwide, information bank that lists people who are doing SoTL and deepen research in Canada? The reason I'm asking is, I'm always thinking that for people like me who have done biomedical research and transitioning towards educational research, that would be fantastic to partner with people who have more experience, such as yourself, and start doing research under their help and supervision. And that would be a great thing. I was talking to a friend of mine in the US, and they have much stronger infrastructure in deepen and SoTL research. And I was telling him the same thing. If we can create such an environment that people know each other, this network, and connect, work together under mentorship of those individuals, I think that's the best way of training people who are transitioning from one type of research to another one. The thing that you did yourself, but in a much, much more meaningful way, I guess.
I so agree with you. And it's been something, there've been some attempts to do that. Mostly it's handled at an institutional level where the Teaching and Learning Center will have a list they know of who's doing this kind of work, who's at least, let them know. We tried to set up in both STLHE, the Society for Teaching and Learning in Higher Ed in Canada, as well as the International SoTL Society. We tried to set up mentoring like that. We had a long list of people who said, yes, I'm happy to be contacted, and nobody contacted them. So that doesn't make it wrong. It means we didn't set it up the right way, because I think the need is still out there. So at the moment, and I'm not really trying to duck the question, but I think the way you find those people is you read articles and then you email them. And I've been amazed at how many people will respond to a direct email from somebody saying, I read your article about this. This is what I'm thinking of doing. Do you have suggestions? I certainly respond to that. So it means a little bit more legwork, but it may mean then that you find somebody whose work is directly relevant to what you're doing.
Yeah, I actually did that. I started contacting people at University of Guelph, at Brock, at UBC and Montreal. That's a great idea. Of course, this is one thing that comes to mind, but I was thinking that I don't know why it didn't work. Maybe one thing that we have here in Canada is that people are realizing more than the past how important educational research is in improving teaching at university level. Nowadays, people are more conscious of importance of this kind of research. So maybe having this sort of data or information or website that can help you find people and connect with them, help them do it faster, considering that people always have the time limits.
One of the
So-
things that has been somewhat successful is SoTL Canada, which is a participating group of STLHE, of the Society for Teaching and Learning. They've been doing in the pandemic what they call a SoTL Roadshow, where they do a webinar every month and on different topics. So what I've seen in that is people have connected to others who are doing similar work through that. Most of the people that I know, I met through going to conferences. And I know that that's more difficult right now. I know that it's not the same when it's an online conference, but I think it's about having a multi-pronged approach to finding out who's doing things. And all I can say is I sure hope they'll try the mentoring thing again, because, you know, I think it was a great idea. I really do. Any other comments, questions? Okay, a couple other things before I get you to do some work. Not real work, it's okay. So I think this is an important thing to keep in mind. There's lots of data that's been written about that when we make a significant course in our teaching, the teaching evaluations tend to drop. And some of the reason for that is that we may be, even without knowing it, a little more on edge, a little more uncertain. We're doing something new. So that could be a little bit unsettling for both us and the students. However, there is data that if you're explicit with the students about what you're doing and why, the evaluations don't necessarily drop. And I have to say, since I read that evidence and in my teaching now say to the students, I'm trying this out, I haven't done it before, but I'm going to ask you how it goes. And I'm hoping that it will do this and this. I don't see a corresponding downward drop in evaluations. But keep notes about how it goes, you know, how you feel about it, what it does to your time commitment, to your energy, and how the students are responding. Your own perspectives on that aren't just part of your data package, they're also part of what will help you decide how you're going to do it, if again at all. So I think just keep that in mind, that change can be challenging. Okay, making results public. Again, talk to the librarian, love our librarians. Have a look at the journals on slide 9 and have a look at your disciplinary journals, either disciplinary education journals or many of the disciplinary journals have either one issue a year or perhaps a column within the journal, a section for educational research. I'm big on the notion of alternative possibilities and also on open access. I have 4 articles placed with two open access journals, and they send me this update. Out of those 4 articles as of yesterday, I've had 4,900 and something downloads. That's incredible. That's more than my mother and one friend who might read what I publish in a peer-reviewed print journal. And I'm being facetious there, but the point is there are ways of making things public where we should think about what's the impact we're trying to have. If we want to change our colleagues' mind within our discipline, a disciplinary journal may make sense, a disciplinary conference. But it may be that we should be making videos. It may mean that we should be using Twitter more often and other things like that. One of the projects that I did that was by accident turned out the way it did has had the most phenomenal impact. I interviewed Gary Poole, who's a founder of Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, and really of teaching and learning in Canada in many ways. And I said to him, you know, trying to do this video, we want to use it for this purpose. It was just to embed it in a course. And so we did the video, and wouldn't you know it, the camera didn't work. So I had great audio and no video. And with that, I asked his permission. I said, I can probably find a student to do this, but what if we do an animated thing and just use your voice as the audio? So along the lines of the RS Animate videos, if you haven't seen those, check them out. I had a student do that. People love it. They just, the number of hits on this has been phenomenal. So think about what's going to reach the audience you want to reach. I've been involved in lots of research suggesting that in terms of impact from Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, the least impact is at the department level. That we don't talk to our colleagues about our work in educational research in our discipline. They don't take up our work and implement it in their own courses. It doesn't make it onto department meeting agendas. It just isn't a topic of conversation. And yet I would argue that's probably where we most want to have impact. So it's just something to think about, is if I publish in a certain kind of journal, it's quite likely that my colleagues aren't going to read it. Whereas if I do something that is more public looking, they might see it. So again, my message is think about where you want to have the impact. I said that regardless of what discipline you're coming from, as long as you have a process that is recognized as a research process, your work will be considered for publication. And Glassick, Huber, and Maroff said, you know, really just as disciplinary research, if your goals are clear and you've prepared well, and you've selected methods that make sense for your question, and you have results that are significant, and I don't mean statistically significant, but significant in terms of being new, being something that builds on work that's already been done, and you've effectively presented it, and you've critiqued it, you've thought about what it means for the field and what should happen next. There's absolutely no reason that you wouldn't be funded and that you wouldn't get published. So I'm going to ask you to do a little activity with me, please. And my reason for this, I wanted you to leave today's workshop with the beginnings of something as a plan that you could use either for funding or for the Teaching Fellows program, or just to get your project going. And it's something I've done many times with both grad students and faculty. I'm going to ask you to think about your project as if it's a giant billboard. And what would your topic on a billboard look like? What would be written on that? And I'm going to read you a sentence stem and ask you to complete it. Just jot something down, whether it's, you know, keyboard or handwriting. Some of them may be really easy for you to answer, and some may be really difficult to finish. And then at the end, just have a look at what was easy and what was not. So when I'm doing this face-to-face, I usually don't reveal the sentence stems, but I think for our purposes, I will show you them. And I'll read them aloud one at a time. And I'm going to ask you to just jot down what would finish that sentence. So first of all the kinds of questions that people mentioned, see if you could pick one topic that you might like to investigate and perhaps propose for a Teaching Fellows submission. So you're thinking about your billboard. I was driving along the road and I saw a sign that said, or jot something down that completes that sentence about your project. I was driving along the road and I saw a sign that said. It made me wonder if the problem was really. It made me wonder if the problem was really. For example, I'd read that. For example, I'd read that. But it still didn't answer. But it still didn't answer. I knew I'd have to read more about. I knew I'd have to read more about. I wondered why others would care, and I decided. I wondered why others would care, and I decided. I also knew some would argue against it by saying. I also knew some would argue against it by saying. This could only lead to more questions, such as, this could only lead to more questions, such as, and at the end, at least in the end, others would know. At least in the end, others would know. Now, acknowledging I gave you very little time for any of those, and I welcome you to come back to the slides to look at them. Which of them felt easy to respond to, and which of them just left you drawing a blank?
Yeah, for me, it was why would others care? That was difficult.
And why is that one important?
Because for me, from my perspective, right, I am, for the majority, like I'm just talking, mine is anti-racism, the majority of the population is white. So for them to try and visualize what racism looks like and how does it feel like, it's just like a uphill battle. You have to be in the trenches, you have to experience it. Otherwise, how else are we going to communicate?
Yeah, and absolutely true. In the instance here, it's from the point of view of writing a research proposal, where if we can't frame why others should care, they're going to wonder why we think they should fund it. So really, the questions were designed to walk you through a research proposal. They are intended to hit on the kinds of things that would be included. For example, some would argue against it by saying invites you to think about the counter arguments, to think about what would be the alternatives. And so it's hard to think sometimes about why others would care when it's really us within our own class. And yet to turn it into a fundable project, we need to, as Sarah mentioned at the beginning, think about how does it relate to the objectives of, the teaching center for the funding, or the institutional process, or if we're going for a SSHRC, does it relate to SSHRC's funding or NSERC, whatever you're going for? How does the project come up with something that's going to matter outside our own course? Because if it's just for us, it's really hard to get funding for that. Any other insights, thoughts about what was difficult, what was easy, or just general comments about the questions?
Yeah, for me, just a general comment, right? For me, a lot of times I feel I'm swimming against the current. and it's so difficult. It's incredibly difficult, right? The resistance that you see, and so sometimes you just feel like throwing your hands up, just saying, forget it, I'll just continue to do what I'm doing.
Well, it's good that you are still doing what you're doing, because it matters. And Abdul, I can't encourage you enough to go and I don't know what literature I would point you towards about people who are specifically teaching the topic you are versus trying to integrate it into other disciplines. But I bet your librarian does. And I bet that if you look at how are others, not just how are they doing it, but how are they researching what they're doing, it might tweak some new ideas for you to help you get at it. Because I think you've got some really important questions there, really important questions.
Thank you.
So thanks for either writing that or listening to it. I'm not sure which you did. There's the peer pressure if we were sitting face to face of seeing others write. But I hope that in one way or another you think about those question prompts or the sentence prompts as a way to walk you through a proposal. A couple other resources, or a few other resources, but I think especially the first two. Each of these is what they're both online, they're free. They are what I would characterize as the basic how-to books for scholarship of teaching and learning. And so you might, I include them both. There are some areas of overlap, but each of them also has some things that are a little bit different from the other. And I would strongly recommend them if you're feeling like you've come from a discipline where you're not sure that you're comfortable setting yourself up in scholarship of teaching and learning. These will provide you with that little bit of a guidebook. I've included the website for SoTL Canada as well as the International Society. And I've also included the Scholarship of Teaching website at Illinois State, just because it has a lot of really great resources. So those may be helpful places to look as well. And hopefully down the road, we'll be able to add the list of SoTL mentors around the country. So Parker Palmer talks about stages of change within an institution and how we make, especially in academic settings, how we make changes. And that notion that isolated individuals start to make a decision about change. And I think in many ways, attending today's webinar and the thoughts that you might have had before that you're starting to make a decision that you might want to engage in this kind of work. I think the really important piece is the second step of figuring out who else is doing this and how can we get together in community, whether that's by conference or through the literature or emailing people whose articles you've read, or just coming together as the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching starts to offer these kinds of workshops. So you get a sense of, oh yeah, okay, I've seen those people attending stuff. Maybe we could meet over coffee virtually and just discuss our projects and see if we can help each other. That the community start to go public, that we get the results of what we're doing out there, and a system of alternative rewards so that everything is not simply based in our institutions on how many articles did we publish in which tier of journal. And so I really welcome the notion of teaching fellows whenever these kinds of programs emerge at institutions, that it supports this kind of work. So I hope, I will encourage you, and I know Sarah will as well, to consider applying for the teaching fellow, and to think about the ways in which the kinds of questions you came up with could really advantage not only your own courses, but other people within the institution.
Just thank you so much for all the information. I know there are some folks that might not be applying for the teaching fellows, but for our other grant, the learning and teaching grant. And I think the thought process you took us through and all the information you shared is really valuable for both grants.
I will hope so.
And we love the questions that you proposed at the end. I think it's a great way to think and look at the way we're putting questions together and putting proposals together. I think everybody loved them as well.
Well, I hope they're helpful. I have certainly heard back from people who said, hey, it worked. I got the money I was supposed to. So may that work for all of you as well. And thanks to folks who are leaving messages in chat. I know some people will have to go before the hour, so that's okay. I'm certainly happy to stay on if people have any other comments or questions.
Yeah, again, thank you so much for joining us today for the wonderful presentation. And thank you to everyone else who joined as well.